When the 438-pound silverback dropped to his knees at 6:47 a.m., veteran ranger Paul Foster felt the world narrow to one sound: Quito's dry, strained retch echoing off reinforced glass in the misted indoor habitat at Kifaru Primate Rescue. For a heartbeat, the gorilla held himself upright, one massive hand braced on wet concrete, shoulders trembling under dark silvered fur. Then his elbows buckled and his chest hit the floor. In a heavy, breathless fold that made two visitors outside the observation wall gasp and step backward. Paul was already running before his radio finished clipping to his vest. "Quito, hey, easy, easy," he said quietly through the steel mesh, voice low in the old cadence he had used for years, his palms open, body angled so he would not crowd him. Quito did not answer with his usual throat rumble. He did not even turn his head. By the time Dr. Layla Mensah, 51, head veterinarian and the calmest person on site in a crisis, came through the service corridor with a crash kit and junior keeper, Amara Ruiz, at her shoulder, Paul's hands were visibly shaking. 19 years on guerrilla rotations had taught him the difference between theatrical discomfort and true physiological distress. This was distress, the kind that drained color from your face before your mind could name why. "Respiratory rate?" Layla asked, kneeling at the barred partition, eyes fixed on Quito's flank. 32 and shallow, Paul said, the numbers coming out clipped. "He was 22 yesterday morning. He staggered before he dropped." Layla nodded once. "We collect now. No dart unless we have to." They moved with practiced precision in the narrow keeper lane, boots slipping slightly on tracked-in moisture from dawn cleaning. Amara steadied the portable light, jaw tight, while Layla drew blood through protected access with minimal agitation. Quito flinched once, then went still again, breath catching at the top of each cycle. Paul leaned his forehead against the cool edge of the mesh for half a second, then forced himself upright and started reading out baseline notes from memory, as if structure could hold back panic. Western lowland male, age 17, stable weight window 196 to 200 kilos over 6 months. No recent sedation, no enclosure diet changes logged. His voice thinned. No known ingestion hazards in habitat. Outside, rain began to drum softly against the skylight panels, and the sodium floodlights painted the wet floor a flat amber that made everyone look sicker than they were. One of the visitors whispered, "Is he dying?" Nobody answered. They were already moving Quito into an observation bay with minimal stimulus. Doors cycling in hydraulic groans, protocols flickering in and out of Paul's head like warning lights. At 7:26 a.m., in the veterinary wing 2 corridors away, the first emergency chemistry panel printed with a hard mechanical click. Layla read it standing up, then sat down without seeming to notice she had done it. Paul watched her trace one line with a gloved finger, then another, then turn the page over as if a second sheet might correct the first. "What is it?" he asked. She inhaled once, slowly. Toxin signature. Not from any wild plant in his enclosure inventory. Not from approved browse. Amara stared at her tablet, then at the paper, then back to Layla. Could this be a false positive? "Not this pattern," Layla said quietly. "Not with this matrix." The room went silent in that unnerving institutional way where machines still beep and refrigerator compressors still hum, but every person inside seems to forget how to move. Paul felt his stomach drop so hard he had to grip the counter edge. He had spent nearly 2 decades telling trainees that most emergencies were ordinary things in bad combinations. Heat, stress, delayed appetite return, subtle infection. Ordinary explanations, containable explanations. This was neither. The blood did not suggest random decline. It suggested contact. Before the timeline rewound, the familiar narrator rhythm cut in with a deliberate pause that felt almost out of place against the emergency alarms and clipped clinical language. Before you watch, remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss another touching story like this one, and write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Then the story snapped backward to the beginning of the shift, because what happened in that misted room at 6:47 had started long before the collapse, and every minute mattered. At 5:10 a.m., Paul had stepped out of the ranger office under sodium floodlights with a stainless flask of unsweetened tea and a clipboard he no longer needed, but still carried from habit. The sanctuary grounds were damp from overnight drizzle, service paths shining, air smelling faintly of hay, disinfectant, and wet soil. Kifaru Primate Rescue sat on 12 fenced hectares outside Macondo Ridge, with 3 indoor habitats, 2 forested outdoor ranges, and 1 veterinary wing connected by gated transfer corridors that could isolate any enclosure in under 90 seconds. On paper, it was efficient. In the half-light, it felt fragile. Paul Foster, 42, senior ranger, 19 years on guerrilla rotations, had begun this particular routine before some of the junior staff finished school. He checked locks, food prep seals, drain channels, camera angles, and overnight behavior logs in the same order every day, because routine caught drift, and drift became emergencies. That morning he reached Quito's habitat and paused before entering the keeper lane, listening. No greeting hoot, no low chest note, no foot shuffle toward the barrier. He keyed in his access code, stepped inside, and saw Quito seated near the rear climbing structure instead of at the front mesh where he usually waited for first visual contact. Shoulders rounded, head lowered, eyes unfocused. It was the posture that unsettled him most, not because it was dramatic, but because it was wrong in a way that felt intentional, like an animal conserving strength while trying not to show it. "Morning, big man," Paul said, softer than usual. He gave the old 2-tap knuckle signal against the steel post. Quito lifted his head halfway, then looked past him. By 5:18 a.m., Paul had opened the overnight intake log and added 1 more line to a sequence he'd been building for nearly 2 weeks. Appetite Reduction Day 12. Social vocalization reduced. Resting intervals prolonged, breathing shallower than baseline. Refusal to hold eye contact during familiar cueing. He wrote each item in block letters, then underlined the date twice. At 5:31 a.m., Amara joined him with her tablet and yesterday's enrichment photos. 24 years old, fast with software, meticulous with timestamps, she had a way of speaking in precise fragments when she was anxious. "His 9-day intake average is 3.2 kilos, she said, scrolling with her thumb. "Baseline for him is 11.5. Water intake down too, but not as sharply." Paul did the math in his head anyway, as if the number might soften if he performed it himself. It did not. "Any substrate contamination flags?" he asked. "None logged." Browse batch was cleared at receiving. He nodded, eyes still on Quito. "Keep pulling 12-day trend lines. Behavior and feeding on one axis, time stamps on the other." Amara hesitated. "You think this is medical or behavioral?" The question hung in the keeper lane between damp steel and humming ventilation fans. Paul watched Quito shift his weight and stop halfway through, as if even that movement cost too much. "Both, maybe," he said finally, "but not weather, not age, not random." At 5:44 a.m., he called Layla from the secondary gate. She answered on the second ring, already awake. They had worked together for 11 years, long enough to skip performance and get to facts. "Give it to me straight," she said. 12-day decline. Today he's quieter than I've ever seen him. Breathing off, engagement off, intake far below floor. Fever? Not yet, but he's withdrawing. Layla was silent for 2 beats. I'll move your blood draw priority up. Keep him calm. No forced transfer unless he destabilizes. Understood. After he ended the call, Paul stood in front of the mesh and lowered himself into a crouch so his eye line stayed below Quito's, the least threatening posture. He remembered the first week they met in 2009, when Quito was an 18-month-old orphan confiscated after a poaching raid. All oversized eyes and defensive screams, refusing bottles from anyone except the ranger who sat near him long enough without reaching. 15 years later, Quito still used one specific gesture when he felt safe. A gentle shoulder tap through protected contact, precise enough to feel like language. That morning, there was no tap. By 6:02 a.m., fog had thickened on the exterior glass, and the first staff briefing had started in the operations room, but Paul remained in the keeper lane, reading each breath, each pause, each aborted movement. He marked the time every 5 minutes. He logged posture changes. He documented what was absent. The sanctuary woke around him in ordinary sounds, gates, footsteps, distant hose pressure, while his certainty sharpened into something cold and heavy. This was not stubbornness. It was not an aging alpha having a slow morning. It was distress being misnamed in real time, and he could feel the clock already running. At 6:03 a.m., Paul checked his watch, then checked Quito's chest again, counting the lift and fall against the second hand as condensation crawled down the mesh between them. One inhale, a short hold, a shallow release. The pattern repeated, irregular at the edges as if each breath needed negotiation. He wrote 30, then crossed it out, and wrote 31. The overhead ventilation kicked to a higher setting with a metallic rattle, and Quito flinched so slightly most people would have missed it. Paul did not miss it. He marked that too. Amara came back through the service gate carrying a handheld thermal scanner, a stack of printed logs, and the tense expression she wore when numbers started arguing with routine. Ops wants morning status in 7 minutes, she said, keeping her voice low. I told them you were still observing directly. Good, Paul said. Scan his flank and shoulder line from there. Don't ask him to reposition. She nodded, lifted the scanner, waited for the tone, then read the screen twice before speaking. Surface temp down 0.4 from his weekly average. Not dramatic, but paired with low intake. She didn't finish. Paul crouched again, elbows on his knees, making himself smaller at the barrier. Quito, he murmured. 2 taps, buddy. He knocked softly against the post. Once, twice. Quito's eyes shifted towards him for a second, then slid away to the far corner, where the straw stayed dry because the drip line never reached it. He moved his right hand, fingers opening and closing against the floor, and then stopped as if he had forgotten why he started. Amara lowered the scanner. He's tracking sound but avoiding focus. I know. Paul stood, took the printouts from her and skimmed the columns. Intake weights, enrichment participation, stool quality notes, hydration estimates. Nothing dramatic on any single line, but together they formed a steep, quiet slope. 12 days. 12 days of drift. In rescue work, sharp emergencies got attention. Quiet drift killed. From the outdoor range, another male gave a low, territorial call that usually pulled a chest answer from Quito within seconds. This time, there was no response. Only the hum of air handlers and the far hiss of hoses in Habitat 2, where cleaning had already started. At 6:08 a.m., Paul radioed operations. Foster in Indoor 1. Request delay on public glass access until veterinary clearance. Quito presenting persistent respiratory change and social withdrawal. There was a crackle, then dispatcher Imani's voice. Copy delay request. Director asks if this is precautionary or urgent. Paul looked at Quito's lowered head, the way his shoulders rose like he was bracing against something invisible. Urgent concern, not panic, he said. But I need controlled noise levels now. Copy, I'll route. He clipped the radio back and exhaled through his nose. Slow. Urgent concern, not panic. He had trained himself to speak in categories because categories got doors opened and resources moved. Inside his ribcage, panic had already taken a seat. At 6:11, he and Amara prepared first feeding presentation in the keeper lane. Steamed yam segments, greens, soaked pellets, and the honey puzzle block Quito usually dismantled with almost playful concentration. Paul slid the tray to the protected slot and stepped back, avoiding direct stare. Food up, he said, conversational, as if naming ordinary things could summon an ordinary morning. Quito turned his head toward the tray. For a moment, hope lifted in Paul so sharply it hurt. The silverback shifted forward one pace, then another, then paused with both hands planted. He sniffed once, a short, cautious draw, and recoiled. Not violently, not theatrically. He simply withdrew, sat down, and curled his fingers under his palms. Amara whispered, "He won't even sample." Paul's voice stayed even. "Log full refusal at 6:11. Note recoil after scent check." She typed quickly. The tapping of her nails against the tablet case sounded too loud in the lane. A minute later, Quito brought his forearm to his mouth and retched without producing anything. A dry contraction that tightened his whole torso. Paul's stomach turned. "There," he said. "You saw that?" "I saw it. Mark 612, dry retch, no expulsion." Amara swallowed and entered the line. Done. By 6:14, Layla was on the speaker in Paul's earpiece while moving between buildings. He could hear doors opening, footsteps, somebody asking for specimen tubes in the background. "I'm 4 minutes out," she said. "Any neurologic signs?" "Delayed tracking, posture guarding, one dry retch, full feed refusal, no aggressive display." "Any ataxia?" "Not yet. He's slow but coordinated." "Good. Keep it quiet." No additional scent exposures, no cleaning chemicals in lane, no enrichment swap until I see him. Paul glanced at the utility cart parked by the gate, a spray bottle clipped to the side in violation of the labeling rule he had argued about twice this month. "Understood," he said, then added, "I want that cart removed from this corridor now." Amara followed his look. "I can move it." "Do it." She rolled it away immediately, wheels squeaking over the damp concrete. Paul watched until it turned the corner, then faced Quito again. The silverback had stretched one arm along the floor and rested his jaw above his wrist, eyes half-lidded, but not asleep. It was a position Paul recognized from old recovery days after Quito's respiratory infection at age 5, when fatigue pressed him flat, but vigilance kept him listening. At 6:18, Layla arrived in blue scrub pants under a rain shell, hair pinned high, gloves tucked in her pocket, expression composed and tight at once. She stood beside Paul, observed for 15 silent seconds, and asked only one question. "When did he last initiate contact?" Paul answered without checking notes. "Yesterday, 3:42 p.m. One finger touch through protected slot during post-enrichment check. No shoulder tap since Monday." Layla nodded. "That gap matters." She opened her kit, handed Amara a specimen tray, and knelt at the barrier with her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. "Hey, Quito," she said softly. "Layla here. We're not pushing you." Quito did not look at her. He looked at Paul not directly but near him, like he was choosing a familiar landmark rather than a face. Layla tracked his respiration for half a minute. "Still elevated. I want mucous membrane color if he gives us angle." He did not. He shifted again, then froze halfway up, forearms trembling for 2 seconds before he settled back down. Paul's hands clenched so hard his knuckles went white. "Don't force a rise," Layla said, reading him. "We take what he gives us." Outside, rain intensified, tapping then drumming against the roof panels in layered rhythms. Somewhere in the corridor, a metal latch banged, followed by hurried footsteps and an apology from a staff member out of sight. Quito startled, then gave a low, rough exhale that sounded nothing like his normal warning pulse. It sounded tired. At 6:23, operations radioed again. "Foster, Director requests whether morning school group can enter observation at reduced noise." Paul looked at Layla. She shook her head once. "Negative," Paul said into the radio. "Hold public access, medical watch in progress." A short pause. "Copy. Director asks for written justification." He almost laughed at the timing, but there was no humor in him. "You'll have it in 10. He clipped off and muttered, "Written justification," while he can barely breathe. Layla did not rebuke him. "Policy keeps records clean," she said quietly. "Records protect animals later. Send it." He hated that she was right and started drafting the note on Amara's tablet while keeping Quito in his peripheral vision. Every sentence felt like stolen time. At 6:27 he signed digitally, transmitted, and returned to the barrier. Quito had inched closer by less than a meter. Not toward the food tray, toward the glass wall that faced the empty observation hall. He sat with his side to Paul, head lowered, and lifted his left hand toward the glass in a slow arc that stopped short by a few centimeters. The hand hovered, then fell. Amara whispered, "Was he reaching?" Paul kept his eyes on Quito's fingers, curled now against wet concrete. "Yes, but not for us." Layla's gaze sharpened. "Mark that behavior. Time-stamped." Amara did. 6:27, directed reach to observation glass, aborted. By 6:30, the indoor lights had fully transitioned from dawn mode to day cycle, brightening every water streak and footprint and making Quito's coat look dull where it should have shone. Paul remembered brushing burrs from that coat when it was still baby soft and patchy. Remembered teaching him to accept oral meds hidden in mashed banana. Remembered the first time Quito chose the shoulder tap instead of grabbing the mesh in panic. 15 years of earned trust lived in tiny gestures. This morning, those gestures were disappearing one by one, and that frightened him more than any dramatic display could have. Layla prepared for a protected blood draw attempt, voice calm and procedural. "Amara, tube labels. Paul, cue him to the side slot if he'll take it. 1 cue only. If he declines, we reassess." Paul swallowed. "Quito, side with me." He tapped the metal near the slot. "Side, buddy." For 2 long seconds, nothing happened. Then Quito pushed himself up, swayed, and took 3 slow steps toward the indicated position. Paul's heart sank and lifted at the same time. Compliance meant trust. The sway meant weakness. "There you go," he breathed. "Good." Layla worked through the barrier as gently as protocol allowed, collecting a small sample while Quito held position with obvious effort. At the needle contact, he tensed, gave a short grunt, then looked straight at Paul for the first sustained eye contact of the morning. The look lasted maybe 1 second. It carried strain, recognition, and something like appeal. Then he turned away and dropped back to all fours. Sample secured at 6:34. "Run her to lab now," Layla said. Amara sealed the tube and moved fast, footsteps fading down the corridor. The next 10 minutes stretched with cruel slowness. Paul stayed at the barrier, speaking in low fragments. Old reassurance phrases that had soothed Quito through transfer days, storms, fireworks from a town festival years ago. You're okay. I'm here. Slow breath. He did not know whether the words helped Quito or only kept himself from splintering. At 6:38, Quito attempted to stand again and failed halfway, hindquarters slipping on wet concrete. He caught himself with both arms, chest heaving, and held there. Paul stepped forward instinctively, then stopped at the line painted on the floor where protocol forbade crossing without full team and authorization. "Can I enter secondary to guide him?" he asked without looking away. Layla answered just as fast. "Not yet. Too risky if he destabilizes and startles. We hold." He nodded once, jaw tight. Holding felt like betrayal, but rash movement could trigger a defensive surge even in a bonded animal under distress. Concern in rescue work was never passive emotion. It was restraint under pressure. At 6:41, Amara's voice came over corridor intercom, breathless from running. "Sample received in vet wing. Preliminary panel in process." "Copy," Layla said. "Any line on full chemistry turnaround?" 17 to 20 minutes. 17 to 20 minutes felt like a cliff edge measured in grains of sand. Rain hit harder, a heavy sheet against the skylights. The sound filled the habitat, flattening other noise, and Quito reacted with a brief shudder that ran from shoulder to hip. He moved toward the front glass again, stopped, then lowered himself to his knees with deliberate care, as if choosing where to fall before his body made the decision for him. Paul's throat tightened. "Layla, I see him." At 6:44, Quito retched again, harsher this time, with saliva stringing briefly from his lip before dropping to the floor. He braced one hand against the glass and left a broad print that slowly slid downward. Two maintenance staff passing outside the hall stopped when they saw him and went still, faces blanching in the reflected light. "Keep the corridor clear," Layla called without raising her voice. One of them nodded and moved the other along. Paul crouched to keep his face near Quito's line of sight through the barrier. "Stay with me," he said, each word careful. "Stay with me." Quito's pupils looked dull at the edges. He took one dragging breath, then another, then tried to shift his weight backward and couldn't complete the movement. His elbows bent. At 6:46, Layla keyed her radio. "Vet team to Indoor 1 now. Crash kit, oxygen support staged outside secondary. No dart unless direct order." Static answered first, then a clear, en route. Paul felt his pulse in his teeth. He had seen gorillas bluff charge, fracture canines, recover from surgery, grieve, celebrate, sulk, and forgive. He had never seen Quito move like this, piece by piece, as if every signal from brain to muscle had to pass through mud. The next minute arrived in fragments he would replay for months. Quito's fingers spreading on wet concrete, the scrape of nails, a soft thud as one knee hit, the reflection of stormlight on glass. Amara reappearing at the corridor entrance with eyes already wet. Layla setting her shoulders and stepping to the emergency gate. Paul reaching out through mesh, even though he knew he could not bridge the distance. At 6:47 a.m., Quito staggered, retched dry, and folded to his knees beside the reinforced glass, and concern became crisis in a single, shattering motion. Layla was through the emergency gate in seconds, kneeling at the protected threshold while two veterinary techs swung the crash kit down to the floor and snapped open latches with trembling, practiced hands. Paul stayed at the mesh, one forearm threaded as far as he could without crossing protocol, his voice low and steady even as his chest tightened with every shallow pull of Quito's breath. "Easy, big man. I'm right here," he said, and this time Quito's eyes found him. Not fully, but enough. Layla kept her tone clinical and calm. "Respiratory support staged. No sedation. We do not chase him. We do not crowd him. Paul, keep vocal contact." She glanced at the closest tech. Pulse ox through barrier if he allows. Amara, document every event marker from 6:46 onward. Amara nodded, swiping rainwater off her tablet screen with her sleeve. Her voice shook when she repeated the timestamp. 6:47 collapse confirmed. Dry retch, kneeling posture, forelimb bracing, reduced response latency. Quito shifted, trying to push himself up, and failed again halfway. The scrape of his palm on wet concrete sounded like sandpaper dragged over steel. Paul felt that sound in his spine. He had heard it once before, 15 years earlier in quarantine, when a tiny orphan with fever had tried to stand and kept tipping sideways onto straw, furious at his own body. Paul had sat in the corridor all night then, reading maintenance manuals out loud because the rhythm settled Quito more than lullabies. Now he used the same cadence. Remember this voice, same old voice, same 2 taps. He knocked softly against the post. Once, twice. Quito's fingers flexed, then stilled. His breathing stayed fast, but the panic edge in his shoulders dropped by a fraction. Layla saw it and moved quickly. Good response to familiar cue. We stabilize in place. Minimal handling. She angled a light, checked mucus color, then looked at Paul without looking away from Quito for long. I need another sample. Small volume. If we're right, chemistry will tell us why he crashed. Paul nodded. He'll give for 1 stick if I keep him anchored. You get 1 chance, she said quietly. At 6:53 a.m., with rain hammering roof panels so hard conversation became half-shouted, Paul guided Quito 1 shoulder width toward the side slot. The silverback swayed as he moved, nostrils flaring, but he obeyed. Layla collected blood with 1 clean pass, sealed the tube, and handed it off. Run stat tox and renal panel, she told the tech. Do not batch, do not queue. The tech sprinted. The next minutes moved like a held breath. Quito folded into a seated lean against the reinforced glass, fogging it with short, uneven exhalations. Paul stayed crouched at eye level, talking about old, ordinary things. The Fig Browse shipment that arrived late last week, the broken Mr. Nozzle Quito used to stare at like it had betrayed him. The way he used to hide peeled yams under bedding as if no one could see a bright orange corner sticking out. He watched for micro signs as he spoke. A blink, a jaw unclench, 1 small turn of the head toward his voice. At 7:04 a.m., Quito lifted his left hand and placed it flat against the glass. Slow, deliberate. Paul pressed his gloved palm to the opposite side. The barrier held, cold and thick between them, but the gesture landed with the force of a confession. Amara looked down quickly, pretending to verify a note while tears gathered anyway. Layla exhaled through her nose, almost a sigh. He's still orienting to attachment cues under distress. That matters. By 7:12 a.m., Quito had not vomited again, but the retching reflex kept rippling through his abdomen every few minutes. Layla started supportive fluids through protected access and ordered renal monitoring every 30 minutes. Paul listened to each instruction as if memorizing a map out of a fire. At 7:26 a.m., the emergency printer in the veterinary wing spat out the first full sheet with a hard, mechanical click. Layla read the page, frowned, then read it again with her finger tracing line by line. Paul stood across from her, soaked at the shoulders, boots leaving dark crescents on the tile. Tell me. She looked up, eyes sharpened by disbelief. Cotinine metabolites present, synthetic pyrethroid markers present. Repeating ratios, not random trace. Amara's voice was barely audible. That can't come from approved browse. No, Layla said, and not from enclosure flora. We're looking at exposure through a handling pathway. The words seemed to flatten the room. Compressor hum, distant monitor tones, rain against the high windows. Paul gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles blanched. Keto had not withdrawn from him because he was stubborn or aging out. He had been trying to tell them something was wrong with contact, scent, timing. The thought cracked something open in his chest. Grief, guilt, relief that the behavior had meaning, and fear of what that meaning required. By 8:10 a.m., Layla and Amara had converted the consultation room into a timeline wall. Printed logs were taped in horizontal rows: feed prep, enrichment packing, keeper entry, behavior notes, camera stamps, lab values. Paul added his observations in block letters beside each event marker, handwriting increasingly slanted as adrenaline wore into exhaustion. Noon looked far away and too close at once. Layla pointed to 3 columns. Look at the spikes: 1640, then 1810, then same window the next day. Clinical downturn follows roughly 90 minutes later. Amara scrolled through surveillance clips, frame by frame. Enrichment tray loaded at utility station 2 each time. Same prep sequence, same gloves on first segment, bare hands on final packing step. Which staff? Layla asked. Amara highlighted roster IDs. Rotating team, but one constant on those days. Nate Bell, rescue technician, shift B. Paul closed his eyes briefly. Nate was competent, quiet, often first to volunteer for quarantine overflow. He was not careless in the lazy sense, but the footage did not care about intention. Layla tapped another sheet. And here's the systemic piece. Protocol crossover allows Utility Station 2 to prep primate enrichment and canine quarantine deterrent materials during overlap windows. Cost-saving rule from last quarter. Paul stared at the printed policy language. Shared sink, shared drying rack, chemical lockbox in adjacent cabinet, mandatory glove changes, mandatory hand wash interval, mandatory surface reset between categories. On paper, safe enough. In a storm week, understaffed, rushed, and trusting routine, porous. The math was brutal and simple, he said, voice rough. If anti-chew spray residue transfers during packing, and keto rejects some food but still handles enough surfaces, dose builds, small hits, repeated. Layla nodded once. Low-dose cumulative exposure fits this panel. We still need confirmatory tox, but this is not a random illness curve. Dread settled like weight on the table. Keto's kidney markers were climbing. If they were right, every additional contact through that chain risked another hit. If they were wrong, they were losing hours chasing a phantom while his organs failed for another reason. At 9:02 a.m., Layla called emergency toxicologist Dr. Aaron Kale and transmitted the anonymized panel, environmental inventory, and camera-derived exposure windows. She put him on speaker. His voice came through clipped and focused. I need raw chromatogram, not just summary values, he said. And I need swabs from Utility Station 2, spray nozzle, glove box rim, and puzzle block molds. On it, Layla replied. He paused. Until I review, treat all cross-station contact as contaminated, full PPE for all primate handling. No exceptions. Paul was already moving toward the door. I'll swab the station myself. Take a witness, Layla said. Chain of custody. By 9:25 a.m., Paul and Amara stood in Utility Station 2 under white task lights that made every scuff mark look accusatory. The room smelled faintly of detergent and something sweet chemical beneath it. Paul documented each swab aloud while Amara recorded lot numbers and seal IDs. Swab 1, prep counter left quadrant. Swab 2, drying rack lower rail. Swab 3, spray nozzle trigger and collar. He paused, jaw tightening as he noticed a thin amber film near the puzzle mold handles, only visible when light hit at an angle. Swab 4, mold grip surfaces. Amara looked over his shoulder. I missed that yesterday. So did all of us, Paul said. They bagged every item, signed transfer forms, and walked specimens straight to the veterinary lock fridge. Physical evidence logged, sealed, and time-stamped. No shortcuts now. By late morning, Quito remained in the secondary bay, still weak but responsive to Paul's voice. He refused full feed, yet accepted small electrolyte gel portions from a protected spoon. Layla took that as a thin thread of hope and tightened monitoring intervals again. At 11:48 a.m., Director Helena Sato entered the bay corridor with a printed incident policy packet tucked under one arm, rain jacket dripping at the hem. Her face was composed, but the tendon in her neck pulsed when she spoke. "I've reviewed your preliminary concern," she said. "No staff names in writing until confirmatory tox clears legal threshold." Paul stared at her. "If we know the chain, we stop the chain." "We have stopped shared prep pending review," Helena replied. "But we do not accuse personnel on preliminary data. That protects the institution and the team." Layla stepped between them before the temperature rose. "Helena, we're not asking for accusations. We're asking for immediate operational disclosure to all handlers so nobody repeats contact vectors by habit." Helena hesitated, then nodded once. "General alert, yes. Individual attribution, no. And all external reporting routes through my office." Frustration hit Paul like heat. Quito was fighting to breathe, and every sentence in the hallway had to pass through policy verbs. Protects, routes, threshold. He understood why systems existed. He had taught younger rangers that documentation protected animals when memory failed. But in that moment, procedure felt like wet cloth over a fire alarm. At 12:20 p.m., they issued a facility-wide contamination advisory without names. Full PPE mandatory. Dedicated prep zones temporary until further notice. Utility Station 2 closed and taped. Nate received the same advisory as everyone else and acknowledged it with a short, pale nod, eyes flicking toward Paul, then away. No confrontation, no spectacle. Just a man realizing, before anyone said it out loud, that his routine might sit inside a gorilla's bloodwork. 3 days into the storm cycle, power fluctuations had already stressed the backup systems, and at 4:22 p.m., a surge hit the east service block. The lights held, but 2 handheld radios died in sequence, batteries suddenly inert despite morning charge. Paul slapped his unit twice, watched the screen blink out, and felt helpless anger rise again. "Battery bank is down in this wing," Amara called from the corridor. "Ops says 10 to 15 for replacements." "We don't have 10 to 15, Paul muttered, then caught himself, forced his voice level, and returned to the mesh. Quito stood at the far end of the secondary bay, swaying lightly, watching him with exhausted concentration. Rain pounded overhead. Hydraulic doors thudded somewhere downline. Without reliable comms, every request had to go by runner. The sanctuary felt suddenly larger, slower, less certain. Paul raised his hand and gave the 2-tap cue against the post. "Stay with me, Quito. We're still here." Quito blinked, took one careful step closer, and rested his knuckles on the floor, waiting. Paul held position, helpless in all the practical ways that mattered and determined in the only one left to him. Attention without break, presence without panic, until confirmation arrived and they could finally name what had been hurting him. The confirmation came as footfalls in the corridor, fast and uneven. Then Amara pushed through the service door with a corded desk phone cradled against her chest. Its coiled wire trailing behind, like a lifeline dragged across wet concrete. "Landline patch from toxicology," she said breathlessly. "Ops rerouted through admin because the East repeater is still down." Layla took the receiver first, one hand cupped over her other ear against the hammering rain. Paul could hear only fragments from where he stood at the mesh with Quito. "Yes, raw chromatogram sent. Understood. Concentrations trending cumulative." Say that again. Her shoulders shifted, and something in her posture loosened by a degree that felt enormous after an entire day of tightening. She turned toward Paul, receiver still at her ear. Aaron says the exposure profile is low dose and repeated, not acute catastrophic. Potentially reversible if contact ended and support continues. For a moment, Paul did not trust his own hearing. He had been running on dread so long that hope felt like stepping onto a board that might crack under his weight. Quito was still swaying on his knuckles 5 meters away, still breathing too fast, still refusing full feed, but the sentence potentially reversible moved through Paul like warmth returning to numb hands. Layla listened again, then spoke with clipped precision. Yes, renal protocol ongoing. No further crossover exposure. We've isolated PrEP. What about transfer sedation risk? She paused, eyes cutting to Quito, then to Paul. Right. With this respiratory pattern, avoid sedatives if behavioral guidance is viable. Another pause. I'll document and execute. Thank you. She hung up and immediately started issuing instructions in the calm, hard tone that meant she had moved from fear into plan. Aaron is sending formal written guidance in 5 minutes through secure mail. We treat this as confirmed operational tox exposure pending final report. Priority is controlled transfer into treatment crate B without chemical restraint. Paul, he has to move under his own choice if we can get it. If we sedate with lungs this shallow, we could lose him. Paul looked at Quito's broad back. Damp fur darkened by humidity, each breath still a labor. He'll respond to shoulder tap sequence if he can focus. Then that is our pathway, Layla said. We stage PPE, clear all non-essential staff, and cycle doors one at a time. Helena has to sign physical entry authorization for you. At the mention of authorization, the old anger flared again, but it was thinner now, overtaken by urgency that had finally been given direction. Process no longer felt like obstruction. Process had become the bridge between diagnosis and action. Where is she? En route from operations, Amara said, already typing. I sent priority red. Paul turned back to Quito and lowered himself into a crouch. Hey, big man, listen to me. He gave 2 soft knocks on the post. We're moving soon, but it's me the whole way. Same as transfer days. Same as when you were small and furious and thought every crate was a trap. Quito's ear twitched at the cadence, and after a beat, he shifted his gaze toward Paul's boots. By 5:40 p.m., the storm had pushed the sky into early darkness, and the indoor habitat lights reflected off the observation glass in pale rectangles that made everyone beyond it look ghosted. Staff gathered in controlled silence behind the barrier. 2 vet techs with fluid lines prepared, Amara with log tablet and backup pen after the network lagged twice, Director Helena Sato holding an incident form already signed at the top, and blank at the critical line where she would authorize keeper entry into the secondary bay. Nate stood near the rear wall in fresh gloves, face drained, eyes fixed on the floor. No one addressed him directly. No one needed to. The day had already spoken. Helena approached Paul at the keeper gate, rain still beading on her jacket shoulders. You understand this is a non-standard entry under clinical emergency exemption, she said quietly. You follow Layla's commands without deviation. I understand. If he escalates, you withdraw immediately. Paul's jaw flexed. If he escalates from fear, I can bring him down faster than a dart can. Helena held his gaze for a second that carried both institutional caution and personal fear. Then she signed the line. Bring him home to the crate, Paul. Layla stepped in before emotion could thicken the corridor. PPE check now. She handed Paul a sealed suit, nitrile undergloves, outer gauntlets, boot covers, face shield, and respirator. Nothing exposed. You are a neutral surface. We do not give this chain another chance. He dressed under fluorescent lights while Amara read each step from protocol and verified it visually. Inner gloves sealed, cuffs taped, respirator fit check, face shield down. Outer gloves on in bay threshold. Her voice had steadied with procedure. It was the way she kept from shaking. When she reached the final line, she looked up. "You're clear." Layla held out a laminated cue card mostly for record keeping, not because Paul needed it. Sequence. Call, 2 taps, sidestep toward transfer lane, pause, open palm, second cue, no sudden reach. He sets the pace. If he stalls, we hold. Paul nodded once. He had performed that sequence hundreds of times across 15 years, but never with stakes this high, never with his own heartbeat loud enough to blur the edges of sound. Quito lifted his head as the inner door motors engaged, the hydraulic whine rising, then dropping into a heavy click. His nostrils flared, his shoulders tightened. Paul stopped at the threshold and waited for the first wave of alarm to pass through the silverback's body. This was the first rule with frightened power. Do not compete with it. Outlast it. "Paul," Layla said through the intercom, "you enter on my mark. Tech team static, doors in manual lock." He kept his eyes on Quito, not staring him down, just present. "Copy." A beat later. "Mark." Paul stepped into the secondary bay. The rain on the roof became a constant roar above him. The concrete smelled of moisture, disinfectant, and the sour edge of stress. Quito rose halfway, swayed, and planted both knuckles again, head angled toward Paul with exhausted vigilance. Up close, even diminished by illness, he looked immense, muscle and memory and wary intelligence housed in one body that had carried too much for too many days. Paul kept his hands low and open. "Quito, it's me." He let the familiar rhythm land before adding anything else. 2 taps. He knocked softly against his own forearm through the glove. Once, twice. Quito blinked, a small movement, but not random. His left hand flexed, then released. Behind the glass, no one spoke. Amara's pen hovered over the tablet without touching. Helena stood with both palms on the rail so hard her fingers whitened. Layla watched Quito's respiratory rate on a monitor feed and mouthed numbers to herself, tracking every rise. Paul shifted 1 step sideways toward the transfer lane leading to treatment crate B, then stopped exactly as trained. "Come with me." Quito took 1 step, dragging slightly through the right hip, then paused and looked past Paul toward the service door where unfamiliar movement and PPE usually meant procedures he disliked. His chest rose fast. Paul saw the uncertainty gather in him like weather. Choose retreat, choose standoff, choose the old defensive script that had once kept him alive. "Hold," Layla whispered into the intercom. "Don't push." Paul stayed still. Seconds stretched, rain pounded. Somewhere downline a door latch clanged and then went quiet again. Quito's throat gave a low, rough sound. Not aggression, not warning exactly, more like effort pressed into vibration. Paul answered with the same soft phrase he had used since quarantine days. "You're safe with me." Quito lowered his head, then lifted it again and took a second step. White-knuckle suspense was not loud. It was silence sharpened to a blade. Every person in the corridor seemed to forget breathers etiquette and started breathing with Quito instead. Shallow when he strained, slower when he paused. Paul felt sweat gather under the respirator despite the cool air. He wanted to close the distance to steady that heavy shoulder with his own hands, but training held him back. Consent first. Always. At 5:58 p.m., Quito stalled 2 meters from the crate entrance. The crate door stood open, steel floor lined with fresh rubber matting and straw, interior lights dimmed to reduce glare. In any other context, it would have looked like a simple transfer box. Now it looked like a threshold between two outcomes nobody dared name. "Keto," Paul said, voice roughened by the mask. "Open palm." He raised his left hand, fingers spread, then lowered it to chest level in the old signal they had paired with cooperative entries years ago. Keto stared at the glove, then at Paul's face shield, searching for the person behind the barrier of plastic and filters. Paul leaned his weight slightly back to look smaller. "Good. Easy." Keto swayed hard enough that his shoulder brushed the wall, recovered, and gave one uncertain half-step toward the crate. Then he stopped again, panting, eyes narrowed. Layla's voice came quietly through the intercom. "Respiration's climbing. If he doesn't commit in 60 seconds, we reassess." Paul heard her, and he also heard the undertow beneath the words. Reassess might mean sedation, and sedation with this breathing was a gamble stacked against them. He swallowed, letting the fear move through without taking control. "Keto, second cue." He gave 2 taps on his forearm. For 1 suspended second, nothing happened. Then Keto crossed the remaining space, not quickly, not dramatically, but with deliberate, almost ceremonial focus. He came close enough for Paul to see the fine tremor in his fingers, then lifted his palm and pressed it against Paul's gloved forearm, exactly over the old shoulder tap zone he had used since he was an orphan, learning trust, 1 contact at a time. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds. It carried recognition so unmistakable that Amara made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, then clapped a hand over her mouth. Helena's eyes went wide, all administrative reserve stripped away by the plain language of that gesture. Layla did not look up from the monitor, but her voice caught when she said, "Maintain, maintain. Let him choose the step." Paul could barely feel pressure through the gauntlet, yet his whole body registered it like heat. "That's it," he whispered. "You've got it." Keto withdrew his hand, turned and stepped into the crate. 1 forearm, then the other. A pause as he gathered his hind legs. Then fully inside, shoulders filling the frame. Breath still rough but steady enough to count. Paul waited until Keto settled his weight against the side panel before he nodded once, towards the corridor. "Door when ready," he said. The steel door rolled forward with a controlled mechanical hum and locked with a deep, final clunk that echoed through the bay. Nobody cheered. Nobody moved for a full heartbeat. The suspense did not break all at once. It unwound in increments, in exhalations, in shaking hands lowering clipboards, in Layla finally lifting her gaze from the monitor and allowing herself 1 long breath. "Transfer complete at 6:03 p.m., Amara said, voice unsteady but clear as she logged the timestamp. "No sedation used." Paul stepped back from the crate, knees suddenly weak, and rested 1 gloved hand on the outer panel, where Keto had disappeared from view, except for a dark shape and the rhythm of his breathing through the vent slots. Rain continued to batter the roof, indifferent and relentless. But inside that locked steel box, there was now a pathway to treatment. And for the first time all day, the clock felt like something they might still beat. The lock engaged, and the corridor seemed to remember sound all at once. The rain on the roof, the hiss of oxygen lines being primed, Amara's shaky breathing, Paul's respirator valves clicking with each exhale as he kept his hand against the crate wall and listened for Keto on the other side. A deep breath went in through the vent slots. A slower one came out. Layla stepped in first, 1 hand lifted to keep everyone else from crowding. "No sudden noise," she said quietly. "He made the transfer. We protect that." Her eyes moved to Paul. "Talk to him while we move." Paul kept his voice low, almost at a murmur. "Good work, big man. You did exactly right. Stay easy. Stay with me. He tapped 2 fingers against the steel panel. Gentle, measured. Once. Twice. Inside the crate, Quito shifted his weight with a muted scrape of straw. He did not hit the walls. He did not surge. He settled. That was the first shock. The second came when Helena, who had spent the entire afternoon speaking in policy language and legal thresholds, pressed her fingertips hard against the observation rail and said, almost to herself, "He touched your arm first. He touched your arm," and then entered. Nobody answered immediately. The sentence landed in the corridor like a dropped instrument. Layla gave the first operational command after the pause. Transfer line clear. Bay to treatment 2. Manual pace. 2 techs rolled the crate trolley into position, locking each wheel with careful clicks before releasing the floor anchors. Amara, continuous video and log. Time, movement, respiratory signs every 30 seconds. Amara nodded rapidly and started dictating as she typed. 6:04 p.m. crate movement initiated. Subject upright in crate. No impact behavior. Moderate tachypnea. Responsive to vocal cue. Paul walked beside the crate as it began to move down the service lane, gloved hand near the vent, matching Quito's pace so the familiar voice stayed in range. The fluorescent lights strobed faintly over wet concrete, reflecting off the crate's steel seams in pale flashes. Each door they passed opened and shut with hydraulic groans that usually agitated gorillas under transport. Quito flinched once at the first cycle, then steadied when Paul spoke again. "You know this route. Same corridor, same turn. You're okay." By 6:08 p.m. they reached Treatment 2, a narrower room with reinforced side panels, overhead camera coverage, and 2 access ports for fluids and oral support. Layla checked the locks herself, then crouched to the lower vent and watched Quito's chest movement through the slats. "Respiration's 28, she said. "Down from corridor peak. Keep him oriented." Paul took position at the front corner, where Quito could see him through the mesh insert. When the silverback shifted forward, the room held still. Quito's eyes tracked Paul's face shield, then dropped to Paul's forearm, lingering at the exact place he had pressed his palm in the bay. Layla noticed it too. "He's checking the contact point." Helena looked between them. "Checking for what?" Layla did not answer yet. She stood and turned to Amara. "Pull all behavior clips from last 12 days where he approached and withdrew from food. I want frame-level timing with prep source tags." Amara blinked. Now? Now. The question carried its own answer. Or had opened a door. Layla was already walking through it. Paul removed his outer gauntlets under protocol supervision, then his face shield, leaving respirator on while techs connected warmed fluids to the crate access line. Quito watched each motion, unblinking. Paul flattened his hand against the mesh insert, not touching through, just offering a steady visual target. Quito leaned closer, nostrils widening as if sorting scent through metal and plastic. "He's scent-checking you," Layla said quietly. "Look where he pauses." Paul followed her gaze. Not his shoulder, not his boots, his hands. He felt a chill despite the humid room. "You think that's what this has been about? Contact residue on handlers?" Layla gave a short nod. "I think he has been trying to avoid specific chemical signatures, and we read it as generalized decline." Amara made a soft sound from the workstation. "I have clip 19 from 3 days ago. Putting it on monitor." The screen filled with overhead footage from Indoor 1 at 4:40 p.m. Quito approached a honey yam puzzle block, reached, stopped, sniffed, withdrew, then wiped his fingertips repeatedly on straw before turning his back to the tray. In the original report, it had been logged as appetite refusal, with irritability behavior. Layla pointed with a capped marker. Freeze there. Zoom on hand motion. The enlarged frame showed the wipe sequence clearly. Touch, recoil, wipe, avoid. Run the next day, she said. Second clip, same sequence, different tray, same wipe. Third clip. Keto accepted plain greens from Tong presentation, refused puzzle block after brief sniff, then moved to the glass and sat with his side towards staff, breathing hard. Paul felt his stomach tighten. He remembered each moment from the floor perspective, remembered thinking Keto was withdrawing from social engagement, maybe nauseated beyond feeding. The pattern on screen was more specific, more intentional, and more painful to realize. He wasn't shutting us out, Paul said, voice rough. He was sorting safe from unsafe. Layla met his eyes and did not soften the conclusion. Yes. For a few seconds, even the room equipment seemed quieter. The infusion pump kept ticking. Rain kept striking the roof in dull percussion. But nobody spoke. Helena finally exhaled and straightened, face drained. We told staff to classify that as behavioral non-compliance. Layla's reply was controlled, not accusatory. We classified it that way, all of us, until the chemistry forced a different interpretation. At 6:17 p.m., the landline rang in treatment 2. Amara snatched it up, listened, then handed it to Layla. Dr. Kale on secure follow-up. Layla put the call on speaker. Aaron's voice came crisp through static. I've reviewed your second panel and preliminary surface swabs. You have contamination concordance between puzzle mold handles and blood metabolites. It is a low-level exposure pathway, repeated over days. Paul closed his eyes briefly. Aaron continued. One more thing. Your behavior clips that Amara sent. The hand-wiping and selective refusal are consistent with aversive response to irritant residue. He was not randomly anorexic. He was making a discrimination. Amara stared at the monitor, hand over her mouth. Helena lowered herself onto a stool like her knees had lost certainty. Layla asked, Can you state that for incident record? Yes, Aaron said. Record this language. Observed feeding behavior aligns with chemically mediated aversion and distress communication. Recommend immediate retraining of interpretation protocols so refusal patterns are treated as possible toxicological signals. Distress communication. The phrase seemed to move through each person in sequence. Paul felt it as both vindication and grief, because the meaning clarified too late to spare Keto the days already endured. Layla thanked Aaron, ended the call, and leaned both palms on the treatment counter. When she spoke, her voice shook once and then steadied. He was telling us, repeatedly, through timing, touch, refusal, and that wipe pattern. We kept translating it into the wrong language. Paul turned back to the crate. Keto had lowered himself to a seated posture, one hand resting near the vent, breathing less ragged now that movement had stopped. Paul mirrored the posture from outside, knees bent, shoulder near the mesh insert. I heard you late, he whispered, but I hear you now. Keto blinked slowly and shifted his hand closer to the vent slots until 2 fingers aligned with the outline of Paul's knuckles on the other side of the metal. No direct contact, just proximity. It was enough to bring tears to Amara's eyes again. By 6:24 p.m., they began controlled oral support, diluted electrolyte gel through a protected port, 2 measured doses separated by 3 minutes. Keto accepted both. Layla logged each response while a tech adjusted flow rates on the fluid line. Outside treatment 2, word had started traveling through the facility despite the storm and comms outages. 2 keepers from Habitat 3 stood behind the secondary glass, silent and pale, watching the screen replay where Keto wiped his fingers after the contaminated block. One of them whispered, He knew. The other answered, he knew, and we called him difficult. Paul heard them and looked down. Nate appeared at the far end of the corridor, stopped by the marked threshold where non-essential staff had to remain. He was in full PPE, mask on, shoulders collapsed inward, his eyes fixed on the monitor, then on the crate, then on Paul's taped cuffs and bare forearm beyond them, as if he were tracking every link in a chain he had never meant to build. No confrontation came. There was nothing theatrical in the moment, only the heaviness of comprehension. Layla noticed him, crossed to the door, and spoke through the gap without raising her voice. You stay there for now. Incident review starts after stabilization. Do you understand? Nate nodded quickly. She held his gaze. This is about process failure and exposure control. Right now, our job is him. Another nod. He stepped back from the line, hands shaking. At 6:31 p.m., Quito gave a low rumble from inside the crate, the first full vocalization since dawn. It was faint, rough at the edges, but unmistakably his. Paul's head came up immediately. There you are, he said softly. Layla checked the monitor and allowed herself a thin smile. Respirations 24, trending down. Awe was giving way to careful relief, but the shock remained, braided into every action. They were treating a poisoning pathway and, at the same time, rewriting what they thought they had seen. Amara replayed one final clip at Layla's request, this one from 5:27 a.m. that morning. Quito lifted his hand toward the observation glass and stopped short. In live time, it had looked like vague withdrawal. On replay with the new framework, it read differently. A social signal interrupted by discomfort, an attempt to seek contact while avoiding the surfaces associated with exposure. Helena watched the frame and pressed her fingertips to her eyes. He wasn't fading out, she said quietly. He was negotiating around pain. Paul nodded once, unable to speak for a moment. By 6:38 p.m., the storm had eased from pounding rain to steady sheets against the roof, and the first replacement radios came back online in clipped bursts from operations. Layla ignored them until she finished the next check. Kidney support running, temperature stable, no new retching episode in over an hour. Partial oral intake tolerated. Then she keyed her handset and delivered the message for facility record. Each word precise. This is Dr. Mensah. Subject Quito stabilized in treatment 2. Post-voluntary crate transfer without sedation. Toxicology and behavioral concordance strongly indicate cumulative handling chain exposure. Final written confirmation pending. All teams maintain full PPE and compartmentalized prep. Behavioral refusals are to be escalated as potential clinical signals effective immediately. She released the button and looked at Paul. What he did in that bay, she said, pressing your arm and stepping in on cue, left everyone stunned. But this is the part we cannot forget. The gesture was not a miracle trick. It was coherent communication under distress. Paul kept his hand near the vent, eyes on Quito's steadying chest. Then we document it like data, not folklore. Layla gave a tired, grateful nod. Exactly. The room settled into working quiet after that, the kind built from purpose instead of panic. Pumps ticked, logs updated, gloves changed in strict sequence. And through the crate slats, Quito breathed in a rhythm that no longer sounded like a body losing ground, while the people around him stood in humbled silence, shaken not only by how close they had come to losing him, but by the clarity of what he had been trying to say all along. At 6:41 p.m., the secure printer in Treatment 2 coughed out Dr. Aaron Cale's written advisory, 4 pages dense with chromatograms, metabolite ranges, and a final paragraph Layla read twice before she handed it to Helena. Exposure pathway consistent with repeated, low-dose transfer at a shared PrEP interface. Immediate cessation and renal support recommended. Prognosis guarded but favorable with sustained isolation. She signed the receipt line, passed the pages to Amara for scan and archive, and said, "Attach this to the incident file and to the director report tonight, not tomorrow." Amara's fingers shook over the keyboard. "Uploading now," file hash recorded. "External copy to regulatory liaison," Helena answered before Layla could. "Yes, full disclosure package. No redactions except personal medical identifiers." Paul glanced up at that, surprised by how quickly her tone had changed from defensive policy to clear accountability. She met his eyes and gave a small, tired nod that paid off the look she had carried all afternoon, the one that had stopped just short of trust. "You were right to push," she said quietly. "I saw the data and still hesitated. I won't do that again." Inside the crate, Keto shifted and gave a low, breathy rumble. Paul moved closer to the vent slots and answered with the old cadence. "Still with you." The silverback's breathing had steadied into longer cycles, and every clean exhale felt like a rope thrown back across a chasm. At 6:53 p.m., Nate asked from the threshold, "Director, may I speak for record?" His voice was thin, almost formal, as if structure was the only thing keeping him upright. Helena looked to Layla, then to Paul, then opened the door 2 feet and kept him outside the marked clinical line. "Speak," Helena said. Nate kept his gloved hands clasped tight at his waist. "On 3B shifts, I handled canine quarantine deterrent spray and came straight to puzzle block packing. I did wash, but I did not run the full 90-second reset, and I removed gloves for fine packing because the block slipped. I believed hand wash was enough. I did not report the shortcut. The anti-chew bottle on Utility 2 was mine, and the label had peeled. I should have pulled it from use." He swallowed hard. "I did this without intent to harm, but I did it. I accept reassignment and retraining, and I'll give a full written statement tonight." No one raised their voice. No one moved toward him. The quiet that followed was heavier than an argument would have been. Layla spoke first. "Your statement goes in the chain of custody packet. You'll include exact times, product lot number, and each day you touched primate prep after canine handling." "I have the lot photo," Nate said, eyes flicking to Amara's tablet. "I sent it at 4:09 p.m. when you requested all chemical IDs." Amara checked, then nodded. "Received. Matched to swab set C." Helena's reply stayed measured. "Effective now, you're off direct animal handling for 30 days, then supervised return only after competency sign-off. You are retained, not discarded. We fix systems and people together." Nate's shoulders shook once with relief and shame mixed together. "Understood." He looked at Paul then, finally holding eye contact. "I kept telling myself he was just being difficult with food. I'm sorry." Paul's answer came rough but steady. "You tell it exactly as it happened and you help build what replaces it. That's how you repay him." By 7:10 p.m., the storm had weakened to a fine, hard rain, and the veterinary wing settled into night protocol. Layla led a live evidence reconciliation at the steel counter so nothing would be left floating as rumor. Blood tubes. A through D logged, frozen aliquots sealed. Utility station 2 swabs transferred to toxicology courier, with signatures from Amara and Paul. The spray nozzle bagged and tagged, glove box rim swabbed, puzzle molds quarantined, utility cart removed from service and marked abandoned pending disposal, and the amber residue photographs attached to the incident appendix. Every item that had carried suspicion now had a destination and a record. "External contact status," Helena said, pen poised. Amara read from the call log. "Dr. Kale primary call 6:03 p.m. Follow-up 6:17. Written advisory received 6:41. Regulatory liaison notified 6:58, acknowledged 7:04, requested full packet by midnight. Operations battery failure report filed. Facilities confirmed charger bank fault due surge and replaced all East Wing handhelds at 6:38. Layla added, and public access hold from this morning has been closed with medical rationale. School group rescheduled. No one enters that corridor until decon is complete. The administrative language could have felt cold, but in that room, it felt like care translated into infrastructure. At 7:32 p.m., Quito accepted his first meaningful food since dawn. 4 measured spoons of diluted yam mash through the treatment port. Then a pause, then 2 more. Paul counted each swallow under his breath. When Quito finished the 6th, Paul's composure broke without warning. He turned away from the crate, braced both hands on the sink, and lowered his head. He was not loud about it, just one long, shuddering exhale that carried 12 days of dread and 1 day of terror out of his chest. Layla rested a hand between his shoulders, said nothing for several seconds, then murmured, "Relief can hurt on the way out." He wiped his face with his sleeve and let out a short, embarrassed laugh. 19 years and I still fall apart over 6 spoons. "Good," she said. "Keep that." Just after 8 p.m., Helena convened a standing debrief in the corridor outside Treatment 2, so Quito would remain within earshot of Paul's voice. She did not stand behind a podium or file cabinet. She stood with wet boots on concrete and read the new directives out loud while Amara projected them onto a tablet for signatures. Protocol crossover abolished effective immediately. Primate enrichment and canine quarantine moved to separate, locked prep kitchens. Full PPE and timed hand wash for every category change. Chemical chain of custody logs each shift. Behavior refusal escalation rule. Updated to include toxicological screening triggers, and all staff retrained within 21 days. One by one, staff signed on screen. When the tablet reached Nate, he signed last, hand still trembling, then asked, "Can I volunteer for decon crew tonight?" Helena nodded once. Yes, supervised. That night did not end with celebration. It ended with work. Nate and 2 facilities techs stripped Utility Station 2 under Layla's checklist, while Amara photographed each step. Paul watched through the doorway as the unlabeled spray bottle that had been clipped to the cart was sealed into a disposal drum, documented and wheeled out. The strange, sweet chemical smell that had lurked in that room for weeks faded under detergent and fresh air exchange. 3 days later, under a clear morning sky after the storm front had finally broken, the team assembled in the new Primate Prep kitchen for first-use verification. Stainless counters were separated by floor-to-ceiling partitions, sinks color-coded, glove dispensers sealed, and a digital timer mounted at eye level above the wash station, so no one could rush the reset unseen. Helena handed Paul the first tray and said, "You set the baseline." He built Quito's puzzle blocks in silence, gloved, timed, witnessed by Amara and Layla. No bare hand finishing, no shared racks, no ambiguity. Before the tray left the room, Amara scanned the chain tag and said, "Custody verified." In Treatment 2, Quito sniffed the offered block, paused, then took it and began to work the honey seam apart with slow concentration. No recoil, no frantic wiping. Paul did not realize he was smiling until Layla nudged him and whispered, "There it is." By the second week of October, Quito had moved from crate rest to supervised habitat returns for short intervals, and each session rewrote one fear into one fact. Intake climbed, kidney markers trended down, breathing normalized on exertion, and his social calls returned in rough but unmistakable bursts that rolled down the corridor and made junior staff stop and grin at one another, like they were hearing music restored after static. The aborted reach to the observation glass from that first morning was entered in the final interpretation report as social contact seeking under aversive exposure, no longer withdrawal. The missing shoulder tap from Monday through crisis was logged as attachment disruption during distress. The hand-wiping clips became training material. On day 19 at 5:27 a.m., Paul stepped into the keeper lane under the same sodium floodlights that had witnessed the beginning. The air smelled of wet soil and cut greens. He gave the two-tap cue on the post and waited, breathing slow so he would not rush the moment into performance. Quito crossed the short distance to the mesh, upright and steady, eyes clear. He held Paul's gaze, lifted his hand through protected contact, and tapped Paul's shoulder with deliberate gentleness, exactly once, then again. Amara, standing behind with the intake slate, started crying before she could hide it. Layla smiled without looking away from Quito. Helena, who had come down early and said she was just checking compliance, pressed her lips together and blinked hard. Paul laughed softly through his own tears and touched the mesh near Quito's hand. "Message received," he whispered. No one called it a miracle. They called it evidence, memory, trust, and a warning they had learned to hear in time. And when morning briefing began 10 minutes later, the first line on the board was no longer a slogan, but a rule written in permanent marker by unanimous vote. Behavior is data, and data is testimony.